Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Research in Progress seminar. I'm Paula Schultz, Director of the Center for Research on Vermont here at the university. This evening's speaker, Gloria Gil, is a Burlington resident now, working in mediation, Executive Director of the Champlain Media Arts, and President of Resources, Inc. But that doesn't begin to tell the story of why she is with us this evening. As I understand it, she had a small grant from the Vermont Folklife Center to help her undertake research on Bennington Potters. It's one of those institutions here in Vermont that we're all familiar with. Many of us probably have a trigger-handled mug at home, but how much do we really know about the history of the place? Well, Gloria was there when it all got started back in 1948, and she's here this evening to share the research that is going into a book on Bennington Potters, and she's going to look at the first 25 years, 1948 to 1973. So please welcome Gloria Gil.
Oh, thank you all for being here. Can you hear me all right? She's doing a voice. Okay? Okay. I had thought of bringing some tapes and making the program a little thicker with the tapes, but Eon told me this morning, he's my companion, that he had a nightmare last night, that he was doing a multimedia presentation and everything went wrong that could go wrong. So I thought, well, that's a warning right there, because I would have had to have queued up tapes to catch a pithy little sentence or two to play for you, but I think I can cover everything and just tell you that there would be people whose memories I have already collected that fit into that particular place. So I will just begin. This is a collective memory. It's my memory, and it's enhanced by other people who I have already interviewed, and still a few interviews to go. And I'll start with the early years, which is 1948 approximately to 1950. And the first question that comes to mind is, how come Vermont? How did we come to Vermont? Well, we began to look, I say we, it was my then husband David and I began to look for a proper site for a pottery. It was to be more than a pottery. It was to be kind of craft design group, a cooperative group made up of different people that could do woodworking and fabric design. And we were just taken with the idea of having a little mini Bauhaus right in Bennington. So we began to look for a place that would be right. And let me say this for anybody who is a craftsperson who wants to have their own situation. You got to have a stake. You cannot do it without something. And the stake we had was that David had been in the Merchant Marine during World War II and had saved about $12,000, which was quite a bit of money in those days. And that was the stake. That was going to find us the property. So we began to look for property. There were other people interested in this idea, other potters, some people doing furniture design, and we were all going to be together. I mean, you know that when you're 18 and 19 years old, everything looks very nice, and you think you could do anything. But we would all be together and live harmoniously, probably have a big vegetable garden we all worked in, and we're very unclear about the details, but we knew that we wanted to have this design co-op, and we began to look for a place to do it. So we looked at a few places that were totally not appropriate. They were charming, though. One had been Benedict Arnold's home, and it had this huge old falling apart house and a huge horse stable, which we said, well, you could do something with the horse stable maybe. But when you began to think of the purchasing it and fixing it up, it was just not going to be okay. when we heard about a place in Bennington, Vermont, we were out at Alfred, which is the ceramic school, and the dean there had gotten a letter from this man, Edgar Johnson. Edgar and Charlotte Johnson had started 2 potteries in Vermont. I think that's quite an amazing record. They started one in Wilmington on a road going up to Higley Hill, which is near Mount Snow. At that time, it was an absolute, you went into Wilmington and you made a left turn as a dirt path, and then you took another road off that one, and then you took another road off that one. And when you got to the end of the dirt road was where they had started their first pottery. It didn't last very long because they couldn't get anybody to work there. I mean, it was just so in such an out-of-the-way place. So then they moved to the roaring community of Bennington and got this barn, this beautiful barn. It was a horse barn, and they began making it into a pottery. And it had a maple floor, beautiful floor. The things you notice about a place when you don't know how to buy a place, you notice how beautiful it looks, how pretty the windows are, how nice the floor is, and you forget to ask things like, is there any heat? Well, there wasn't any heat. It was truly an unheated barn, but there's no way you could know that unless you were out looking for that kind of thing. So we went over in the spring to look at this building, and it seemed appropriate. It seemed that this would be a good building for us. It had been a pottery for briefly. We had no idea how brief it had been, but apparently Mr. Johnson was really good at setting up a pottery. He knew just how to do it. He loved the details of it. He liked to build, and he built his own kilns, and everything was homemade, and everything was tiny. And we didn't really know about that. We just knew here's a building. And I think when you go into something, this is a cautionary tale for young people going into the crafts. Just do it. Don't start worrying if the building has heat or whatever. If you start worrying, that, as they say, sweating the details, you're not going to do anything. So just plunge ahead, which is what we did. And then there were 2 local people in Bennington, Francis Morrissey and Norton Barber, who really helped us achieve this thing. Norton Barber's, we found out years later, was a direct descendant of the original Norton, John Norton of the Norton and Fenton Potteries. And he never said a word about it. He just helped us, tried to help us with this. So we finally were able to, we liked the building. We liked the town. I mean, Bennington in 1948 was all charm, I can tell you. It was very nice. And I had once known a Bennington person a Bennington College student who was on a non-resident term in a library that I was working on right after I got out of high school, before I went to college. And I liked her very much. And so I figured it must be a good place. And so we went about getting the barn and getting started. And this all came about in about 1948 in July, because it was lovely weather. That's why we didn't notice that there wasn't any heat. We didn't notice that till it got to be about October. And when we looked at each other and said, well, what do you think they did for heat? And we found out they didn't. They never opened in the winter. Let me just go back for a moment and explain about the pottery was set up for very small pieces. The people that had the pottery, the Johnsons, made things that looked very much like Royal Copenhagen, if you've ever seen that sort of bluish gray, very fine, with little drawings, nice little drawings on them. Everything was about that big. So everything was tiny. And they had these very beautiful tables set out, and they mixed the clay in an ice cream mixer, and everything went into a little pitcher like this, and they poured their little dainty molds from these little tiny pitchers. And we made big pieces. They also had they had 2 kilns, but they were small. And they had doors that you had to rebuild every time you fired the kiln. You'd have to take the whole thing apart and then stack all the little fire clay pieces neatly, and then try to remember how you did it, and then rebuild the door. So every time you fired the kiln, you'd have to build 2 doors and then take 2 doors apart to open it up. But hey, nothing stopped us. That was okay. So I have the mysteries of the kiln in my notes. The mystery was that Edgar Johnson loved to build things. He liked to build things that were really Rube Goldberg type gadgets, tricky, and they all had little features to them that were clever. And he probably took the secret to his grave, you know, how he did it. But so it was like a continuing, ongoing struggle to try to figure out how these little burners worked. They were oil-fired burners that had a tendency to back up, so you had to watch them all the time. And at the time, we were making pottery that was a reduction body and glaze, which meant that you needed to have incomplete combustion taking place in the chamber in order to get the kind of colors. Those are those beautiful, rich Chinese colors that you see, celadon greens and beautiful plummy reds. And so we dropped the burners at a certain time, and the kiln would fill with carbon. You were actually making carbon black. And the whole place, Jean is sitting here. Do you remember how the whole place would fill with carbon black? And if you were sitting down having dinner or something, or talking to people, as you were sitting there, everybody's nostrils would begin to get little black rings around it. And everybody's neck would begin to turn black. And if you had, I remember having knee-high socks and my knees turned black. Everything would get coated with lamp black. And it was just this. And of course, the roof, the ceiling, everything was covered with lamp black. But the glazes were beautiful. I didn't bring any with me, but you have to take my word for it. They were just wonderful reduction colors. And then we had to think of the name. We didn't really have a name. We didn't quite know what to call ourselves. So we decided, well, why not be cooperative design? It could be design cooperative or cooperative design. And the logo, which I've read with amusement in some places doing research on early Bennington Potters, they say, well, the logo, they know that the logo, what it means. Well, it doesn't mean anything that anybody said. It's very simple. We had, it means we work with our hands and our minds. It's supposed to be a big hand and a brain, really. And it came from a mural that David entered a mural contest, and he won, and I think it was $100 he got, and then it turned out it was a wall about as big as that whole wall. He had no idea how big the wall was, and it was for the ag school, so he designed this mural, which was, you know, growing corn and doing all the things you would do in agriculture. And then the thing was, what we think we work with our hands and our minds, and he had that theme was in it, and he liked it, so we kept it. We carried it over. So if you ever see a piece of Bennington Potters, you see that it looks, I don't know what, you probably know what it looks like, but it's not anything other than we work with our hands and our minds. Then we set up for production. The interior of the barn, as you walked into it, it was this, as I said, it had this beautiful maple floor, and it was a nice big room, and it had a central sink of copper. And then off, there was 2 rooms off with the kilns were in them. And then there was a room, a shipping room, tiny. Because I said, remember, they made tiny little pieces. So our pieces filled it up very quickly. But why did we need to get into production? Why did we go right from school into production? Because aside from wanting to get this design cooperative to be a reality, which is to get going, 2 of the people, David and his friend Stan, had a show at a gallery in New York City, and it had been very well received, and people really liked what they saw. And so the gallery had started taking orders on what was there, and they took quite a considerable number of orders. I forgot the cash value of it, but it was probably about $4,500, which was a lot of business to get. And so we said, well, we just got to make it. And so we were in business immediately. Now, all of the designs and the glazes and the body formulas, all that had been worked out by all these guys when they were at Alfred, when they were students, in their student days. In the basement of Alfred, there was every student staked out a little section of where they were going to work. They had their little workplaces, and they were in production. They were actually working on things. Everybody was very was very full of the ideas of design. Remember, this is right after World War II ended, and Scandinavian design had just begun to come into this country. Danish modern, Swedish, Marimekko hadn't even hit the country yet. That was in the 60s, but everybody was really caught up with the Scandinavian look and very influenced by the whole idea of the Bauhaus, which was, form follows function, good design is important, and that was really the philosophy. There was a philosophy that went with this whole operation. And so we had a friend, Jerry, who was one of the original people who was going to be, there were like 4 people that were going to be involved in this production business. And then as the weather got cold, there was only one. That was David. Everybody, and Jerry on the weekends. So everybody, all the summer soldiers left. And so setting up for production was quite an undertaking. Our first employee is present, Jean Eckwall. She was the first, and she might want to say a few words about having worked at the pottery. 50 cents an hour, but she had a room for $5 a week.
Right. Oh, it was an apartment.
An apartment.
And you used my tub for.
Oh, I'll get to that because we stayed in the barn. I mean, we had the pottery downstairs, and we took this lovely space upstairs, which was a hayloft. It was huge. It went up 20 feet. You could see daylight, and it was cold. And downstairs there's a little bathroom under the stairs, toilet and a sink, but no place to bathe. So we bathed around. With thanks to the goodness of our friends, we were able to. And I worked at the hospital. It was a snap for me. I just go over to the nurse's lodge in the lunchtime and take a hot shower. But poor David was sort of stuck in this cold barn. And so we managed, and thanks to our friends, we were able to eat and keep clean. I mean, they all fed us and gave us a place to bathe. And then in the summertime, we used to go up on Mount Anthony. There was a mountain stream up there, and a place called the Hemlocks. And there was like a natural pool, and we'd keep a bar of soap up there. But it was such cold water. It was the kind of water when you jump in, you can't catch your breath, But that was what we had, and that was. Pardon?
You slept in the cold? You slept?
Yes.
Oh, my.
Well, what we did was we got the largest space heater that Montgomery Ward's has. It's like a candle in the wind, though. I mean, we had one day we were getting up in the morning, and what we would do we would take turns and put all of our clothes that we were going to get into on top of the space heater and get them all warmed up, and then jump back into bed, and we'd get dressed under the covers into these warmed up clothes. And it was cold. I remember reading The Red and the Black. I was watching it on television the other day, and I put the book right on top of the space heater. I mean, this was the biggest one that Montgomery Ward's made. But, I mean, what are you going to do with 20 feet? I mean, it was a big space. I can't remember how I can't give you the exact dimensions, but you have to believe me, it was big. And one day, David looked up and he said, "My God, I can see daylight." All the heat is going up there. So the first project began to be closing off the ceiling, putting in sheetrock to just close the ceiling. And then we had a massive insulation project that went on, and everybody would come over, and we'd all hammer in rock wool bats. You know how a barn has all these beams coming down, so we were just filling it up with rock wool bats. And people remember coming over to do the rock wool bats. So So we had Jerry coming up on the weekends. Jean was our first employee, first time. She got paid 50 cents an hour when she got. Did you get paid every week?
Thanks to your friends who loaned you money to pay me.
Well, so the answer is yes.
Yes.
Right. And so I said we had money problems known as cash flow because we just didn't know how to go from the making it to the selling it to the collecting the money. I mean, we learned that pretty quickly, but those first few months it was really tough. So we were making dinner plates, cups and saucers, pitchers, tumblers, ashtrays. Pretty much that was a lot, cookie jars, some really quite nice, beautiful pieces. And the question is, which is the next part, is distribution, which is a major problem for anyone in production, in the production of anything. How do you get it around? Now you've got email, or you've got eBay, and you've got, but in those days it was, you had to have markets. How do you develop your markets? And that was tough to do. So everybody's had problems. Wedgwood had problems doing it. And so did Norton and Fenton, the early pottery in Bennington. In fact, their distribution problem was so severe it put them out of business, really. So it's something that is serious. You have to learn about marketing. Look at all the things you have to know. You think all you have to know is how to make it. But after you make it, what do you do with it? You put it on a shelf in the little tiny shipping room and hope that somebody will come and buy it. I remember coming home one day from the hospital and David said, if you didn't have tomato juice in that pitcher, I could have sold it. So it was that close, really. So then we had to learn about marketing, and we didn't know quite how to do it, but some woman who was a weaver in Detroit, her father was a salesman for Detroit, and he covered big stores like J.L. Hudson's. He was a very good salesman. He called us up one day, and he said he had seen some of the pottery, and he really liked it. Could he have Detroit for territory? And we said, it's yours. He was the first salesman we had. So we were carried by Detroit for a while. And then after a while, we began to develop. We got the idea. You got to have salespeople. If either you're going to be out there selling it, and who is going to be making it, or you're going to be making it, and somebody's going to be out there selling it. And so you have to yield to the idea that there has to be a salespeople going out there. And so you learn about marketing, and you learn about looking for a good agent, because we've had bad agents. We had some really bad agents. When that trigger mug, which everybody knows, was first done, our what we thought were good agents, our bad agents, took it to Japan and knocked it off. And sold it to J.L. Hudson's, of all places, copies. So we were. And you can sit and defend your designs if you have design patents, but the best thing to do is just keep making design. What you've got is you can keep doing a lot of different things, and they're just taking your ideas because they don't have any ideas of their own. But that was kind of a shock to have our own agent copy us. But then we've had some very good agents, we've had some very bad agents, and we've had a real mix. We had an agent from Burlington, Sidney Samuelson. I don't know if any of you ever knew him or knew his family, but he was our Vermont agent. He had the exclusive rights to Vermont, and that was good. He did a good job for us, and we really treasured him. And then we got into things that the pottery began to get some awards, which was nice. I mean, recognition was coming. We're up to 1950, which is just 2 years after getting started. And I think the first Good Design Award was given to a piece of pottery. Now, the way that worked was the Museum of Modern Art, with the guidance of Edgar Kaufman Jr., who's a big design person, would pick products that came out and give them Good Design Awards for either they were well made, they were hot on that form follows function idea too. So if it looked like form was following function, the chances are you would get some recognition. So the first one came in 1950, and then 1951, there's a point at which I went back to school to finish school, and I went to Bennington, which was convenient. I was still working at the hospital. That was tricky, but it was okay, because and I didn't have a car. I used to borrow Jean's car, which was like, remember your old Plymouth?
No, I remember it, but I don't remember it.
That I borrowed it, not too often, but mostly I'd get a ride, but I'd borrow it every once in a while. She had one of those old fancy Plymouth cars.
1934.
Yeah, and it had window shades. You could pull them down. It was simply great. Anyway, I went back to school. I was in Bennington then, and we became very good friends with David Smith about that time. He used to come over to the pottery a lot, and he was always good with advice, and he was really good about lending us money, which was, we'd do exchanges of checks. He'd give us a check, and we'd give him a check for a month from now or something. And that was his suggestion, not ours. He was very generous and kind person, and he gave us a good art perspective about what was going on, and really kind of brought us into another circle, which we were happy to enter. Because in the meantime, recognition and prizes were coming for the cooperative design pottery, and some personally for David. Good Design Award 1951 and 1952. First prize from the National Ceramic Show at the Everson Museum in Syracuse, in which we three rode over in a blizzard on, what is that road? The Cherry Valley Road, if anybody of you have ever been on it. Gets a lot of snow. But we made it. And then we suddenly began to have national distribution with a good agent. And we opened our first outlet store, which was interesting to us because this was a point at which we were practically starving, and we hadn't figured out how to convert goods into money yet. We were still having that problem. And we thought, well, because people would come to the pottery, which was on a side street off a road, and you had to really want to find it. We thought, well, why don't we put a little shop right on Harwood Hill? And so we found this little garage, which was little, and we really gussied it up. We put, with very little money, pipes. We always had lots of pipes around, and bits of canvas, colored canvas, and made tables. We thought it was fine. And it was hard to see it, though, as people would be coming up Howard Hill, and they got towards the top, and they had a clear way. They just go shooting by. But we did get some people to stop. In the first week, I think we did $85 in sales, and that was thrilling. I mean, that was cash. That was like taking all the stuff you've been making and getting paid for it right on the spot. You didn't have to pack it up. You didn't have to ship it out. You didn't have to do anything. All you had to do was make change. It was just a great revelation to us. And I think we had one of the first factory outlets. It wasn't at the factory yet, but that came about. But that was in 1953. And that made a tremendous difference in our cash flow, because we knew that in the summer, from about Memorial Day till what's the big holiday in October? It's the busiest day of the year. Columbus Day, we would have cash. So that was a great relief to know that. But then in 1953, this time we were living up in Arlington, in Fred Eric's old house. I say that because, in Vermont, every house is called by the name of the people who lived there before you. So we lived in Fred Eric's old house, and we became parents. And then, so the rules changed. It was not okay anymore for us to operate the way we were doing. We said we have responsibilities. We have to make this pottery pay, or we can't do it anymore. It has to pay for our way. So we decided we would remodel the upstairs of the barn. I mean, I'm not saying we didn't do any business, because we did, and we did have money coming in. We couldn't have operated if we didn't. But we realized that we now had different kinds of responsibilities. So we took the barn and we made an apartment upstairs, and then we could move back to Bennington from Arlington, and that was in 1956. And we were living there. We had 2 children, and we had a very attractive apartment. It made a beautiful apartment. And of course, with lots of interesting things done with all the, building parts of an old barn, the beams and everything. We really used everything. It looked very handsome. But one night, right after we had turned off the kiln, we were talking and getting ready for bed. We could smell smoke. We could smell something burning. And David ran downstairs and he yelled up and he said, "Grab the kids and get out of here." So I was in my slip. I remember putting on a coat and grabbing one child under one arm and one out of the other and running down the stairs. And I couldn't see him. It was all smoke in there. What had happened was that we had a stack going out of the kiln out of the wall and into a chimney. We had a person who worked at the pottery who was a disaster. Every once in a while you meet somebody where no matter what they do, it can kill you. So if you said, "Would you fix that wire?" They fixed it. If you touched it, you'd get electrocuted. So this was that kind of a person. And there had been some chinks in the part of the chimney going into the wall. So he'd been told to close up the chinks, and so he did almost all of them. And the few that he didn't get, all the heat was concentrated coming out of there, and it hit the wall, and it went up the wall. And there was this, remember, this was a barn, so there's a space between the downstairs and the upstairs. There's a crawl space, or a cat, we used to call it the cat space, because the cat used to like to go down and sit in that place. But it was full of hay, old hay. So the fire started, and I don't know how he did. He said he just went and he knew where the hose was. He got the hose and he connected it and turned on the water and put out the fire and saved the place. I mean, the place would have gone. It was let me just tell you how this barn was built. It was built so incredibly heavy. It was like they chopped down a tree and cut off the bark and used it, and then chopped down another tree. I mean, it was so sturdy. It was such a beautifully built old building. It wasn't plumb. I mean, it tilted a little bit in different places, but I don't think barns ever are. It was just a beautiful building, and it would have taken a lot to have burned it down, but a fire like that could have really been a disaster. So we were able to survive that, and then we put a full-time outlet right at the pottery so that we could take things out of the kiln and put it in the store, and people now could find their way up there, except my oldest daughter used to stand on the path, and she was a little girl, and just say, "They're closed." So, but then we just began to outgrow our space. I mean, we were getting successful, and by this time it was 1958, so we had survived 10 years, and we were beginning to grow out of that space, and we decided we had to move to bigger quarters, that we had put an addition on one side of the barn, an addition on the other side of the barn. It was just not going to work. So we began to look. We even got invited up to Burlington in 1958 to look at a couple of places. We looked at the place where there was a bottling plant down where on the waterfront where, I'm trying to think of there's a couple of law firms there, and Indigo is right on the other side of it. It was absolutely beautiful building. It had a curved wall that faced towards the lake. But it was all wrong because it had all these pillars, and we'd have to get everything out because there's no way you could put in production. But it was a great building, and we thanked the people that invited us up and said we'd have to think about it. And we went back to Bennington, and there was a big story in the Bennington Banner saying that we were thinking about moving to Burlington, and we had a lot of calls from local people who said, "Please don't go, we would understand." And then people began to offer us different spaces. And then in 1950, so this was in 58, 59, we were offered a space in a feed and grain business it was F.W. Meyer's company. And it was, I would say, a pretty had been a very successful feed and grain business at one time. It was it was about 3.5 acres. It had a lot of buildings. It had a beautiful grist mill with a hammer mill in it. It had a big, large building on the north end of it that had been a repair shop for all the equipment, farm equipment. So it was a big building. You could drive tractors right into it. It had a cement floor, and it was a very promising looking site. It had a little front building. It wasn't so little, but it was a front building where you could drive your truck up with its load of coal, and there was a scale to weigh it. It was that kind of a business. It also did repairs on washing machines. It sold washing machines. It was what a feed and grain business used to be like. I remember going there to buy feed. Oh, that was another thing we had. People were always giving us things. Somebody gave us a couple of Muscovy ducks one year. And so I knew Meyer's company because I had to go down there to buy feed for the ducks, which, by the way, we got to eat one, and one was so sassy it got attacked by a dog, which it had first attacked, so we never got to eat that one. But I knew where the feed and grain business was, and I'd been down to look at it, and we went down and looked at it. It was very promising. There was another building. There's a big plastics company up in Arlington, Mac Molding, and they were renting some space to just store stuff. And the whole other side of it, the shop side, was empty. The grist mill wasn't part of the deal, or was it? I don't think, no, because there was a guy who was still there, Noel Olin. He had a business of feed and grain, and he did he was also a horse trainer, so he was very popular, and he was always busy. He ran his business right into the ground because he really liked training horses more than he liked running the feed and grain business, and so he had trouble with his business, and he finally had to close it. And then we were interested in renting the whole property. But what he used to do was, Noel Olin, he would drive a car in, and when it didn't work anymore, he would park it in the middle. It was there's a lot of space in this property, and he would get out of it, and he would leave it, and the door may be open, or he'd open the door later because they'd cannibalize it, and pretty soon there was a dinosaur yard. There was an elephant graveyard of cars. There was an absolute mountain of cars in the middle of this property. So when what happened was, there wasn't anything we could do. We were simply renting just like everybody else. And we were doing very well. There'd been, we were converting this space into a production pottery. We were undercapitalized to the max. When we went to the bank and told them what we wanted to do, they said, sure, what do you think you'll need? So I kept it very modest, and of course it was about half of what we would need to move and rebuild and everything. So we really, the bank, the first time we ever went to a bank in Bennington, which was like in 1948, and we said we wanted to borrow money for a pottery, and they said, for a pottery? For a pottery, they couldn't believe it. And of course they wouldn't lend us the money. They said, the only trouble with you is you don't have any money. Well, when we bought the barn, we made things you would never do. Today you would never do what we did, which was we didn't really negotiate about the price. She had her price, and we just were saying, how could we do this? And if we do it, well, we won't have any money. Working capital, we didn't even know what working capital was, but we knew we wouldn't have any money if we paid her everything she wanted for the barn. So we ended up paying just about everything she wanted for the barn, and we had no working capital, so it was very difficult. So when we asked the bank for money, they said, "Oh well, we can't lend you any money because you don't have any money." We didn't understand that, but now I do. I've learned dealing with banks. So we were undercapitalized for the move. This was 1960, and it really looked bad. I mean, we looked like we were going to go out. Couldn't make it, But, there was no way we would not make it. There was just no way. So we just did whatever we had to do. We wrote to everybody we owed money to, and said, we're just having a hard time, but we will take care of this. So then everybody said, fine. Said if we pay, and it's like, I think what people want to know is they want to know that you know that they're looking to be paid. And once we understood that, we just said, you have to keep in touch with people. And if you say, I'll pay you $1 a week, you have to pay them $1 a week. And everybody was agreeable. The only people that were really working against us was the bank. They wanted us to go into receivership and write a letter to all of our suppliers. And we said, if we ever did that, that would be the end of it. They would never deal with us again. No way. We'll write to them ourselves. We'll tell them what the situation is, and we'll deal with it. And that worked out. So we survived. And as like a reward, that winter, Vermont Life did a really nice story about the pottery. And they had a first-rate photographer, Clem Kalischer, took all the pictures. And it was absolutely about 6 pages. That was the winter issue of 1961 of Vermont Life. And then, spurred on by this, the Bennington Banner, which had just never said boo, suddenly discovered us and wrote a really nice feature article with lots of pictures in it. And we were having lots of business, everything was great. And in 1962, on February 16th, there was a devastating fire. There was a fire at Bennington Potters. There was a fire at the General Stark Theater, which was a beautiful theater. There was a fire at the Bennington Banner. There were about 4 fires in one weekend, and we unfortunately were one of the victims. So it looked really bad. We were back in adversity again. I thought, how can this be? But the outcome of the fire was the insurance company kept saying, don't feel so bad, Mrs. Gil, it's going to work out, it'll be okay. But we had just gone through the whole place when we moved, and we knew everything that was in there because we had insured everything for what its value, replacement value would be, because we had a good insurance agent who said, you better do that. The only thing we didn't do that he suggested we do, they said, get business interruption insurance. I said, we would never need that because we would go right back to business. Little did I know. But so it took forever. Here's what happened with the fire. The roof of that shed in the back where all the manufacturing took place was wood. It was huge beams like in a barn. But it had a slate roof in it, and as the beams weakened, the roof began to sink. And what it was sinking on was our kill. We had a nice kill, beautiful kill there. It was sinking on the kill. And while we were negotiating with the insurance company, and we were going through the list of everything that was lost, and the thing they settled very quickly was the second floor of one building collapsed. In it was a stove that had been given to us by a Bennington person, John McCullough. It was his former wife's family was in the American Standard Company, and they had done this big stove for an exposition in Paris, and it was biblical scenes. It was so bad, it was good. You know how something can be so bad, it's good. It was so campy, and we had that stored in the upstairs of the building. And when the upstairs collapsed, all these tiles, I think we saved 3 or 4 tiles. That they wanted to do something about immediately. So I said its value is practically nothing, really. But it worked out. It worked out because what happened was we wanted to get back into production. We were very busy. We had all kinds of business. So they wanted us to dump all the pottery. We said, no, fire can't hurt of pottery. Just let us hire back all our people, and we'll wash all the pottery. So they said, okay. So we washed all the pottery and cleaned it up real nice, put it back on the shelf, and then we could ship it out. And we ended up buying the building. At that point, all the banks wanted to finance us. They said, here's a nice piece of property, and it was going for distressed property. So the price was right, and so we were able to buy it. And so then we had to reorganize on a much larger scale. And the scale was, we put in a real shop. The whole front was a shop. And the grist mill, we began to use the grist mill. And we were back, and this was about 1963. In the meantime, we had started a couple of very interesting programs that I don't think I've ever heard of a pottery ever doing, which was we had a master's program with Alfred, so that students from Alfred in the ceramic school could come to Bennington Potters and get their master's degree by working on projects with us. And then we started an artist in residence program so that potters could just come and work at the pottery and have the use. And in some of the tapes that I have, you hear some of these master potters, artists in residence, talking about what it meant to them to just come in and have all the clay that they'd ever want to use, and to have the use of a kiln, big kiln, firing at a high temperature, and at their, for whatever they wanted to do. So we had, our first potter in residence was Jean Parsons from Cranbrook. She was a real master glazer. Boy, her glazes were fabulous. And she threw beautifully. She was a really first-rate craftsman. She'd been like an apprentice. I don't know if you know the ceramic business, but Maya Grotel was a potter of great skill in glazes, and Jean had been her sort of protege. She was our first potter in residence, and then we had Mamo Tessema came from Ethiopia, and he was a master candidate from Alfred University, and he stayed with us and got his master's and went back and actually became the director of the State Museum. He never actually, the emperor decided he wanted to have pottery made in Ethiopia, and he sent Mamo through the USIS or whatever people would get sent over with. But he never got to really manufacture it. After he left Bennington and Alfred, he got to be the director of the State Museum. Then the next design artist in residence was Yusuke Aida, who came through the Boston Museum School from Japan. And he was a very excellent designer and a skilled potter. He was a graduate as a landscape designer, landscape architect actually, but he liked ceramics. And I didn't mention all the important people that are influences on people making ceramics, but one of the great potters was Hamada, who was a potter in Japan, who was a friend of Bernard Leach's, who was an English potter who had influence on everybody that did pottery. So Yusuke had known Hamada but had not been his student, but he had been apprenticed to a very fine potter. It was considered a great come down for him to go into ceramics from being a landscape architect, because he's being a professional person to an artisan, and in Japan it's just not cool, really. But he was wonderful, and he stayed with us. He designed all the, there's a whole line of dinnerware that Yusuke designed that we still make. And then we had Bill Lau, who came from Taiwan through Alfred, and he was a master's candidate in that program. Then we had Londa Weisman, who was a potter in residence. And we had Pat Probst, who was a potter in residence. And let me tell you how many people spun off from Bennington Potters and started their own potteries. We had Mamo, well, he became the State Museum. Yusuke has a big tile business, very successful in Japan right now. Londa has a pottery in Bennington. Pat Probst had a pottery right over the line in New York State. Robert Burnell, who worked there, who died recently, he had has a pottery in Jacksonville, in Vermont. So there's 3 potters in Vermont that are, and Charlotte Potok, who also worked at the pottery. She has a pottery in Plainfield. So there's 3 right there, right in Vermont, who stayed on, started their own potteries. And what did we get? We get from it? Well, we got another point of view of fresh direction, really. And that's very important. You have to keep looking at what other people are doing and what's happening. I mean, I don't even know what's happening in the ceramic world anymore. But at that time, we looked very carefully at what was going on, and we had been included in a lot of major shows. We were at the Museum for American Craftsmen. 2 of our potters, Bill Lau, the one from Taiwan, and Yusuke Aida, had a show together, and that show went on tour the country. Londa Wiseman has a wonderful pottery right in North Bennington, and she's, I think, a fantastic potter. She told me she took a sabbatical last year, but she's really good. And, well, they just brought something in that was good. That was something good. Now we come to the Art in America project, which is in 1964. And how did we get into it? This was an idea that somebody had. I'm not sure. I think it was Alexander Lieberman was the art director of Vogue magazine. It sounds like his kind of idea, but it could have been his son-in-law, Cleve Gray. And what it was how about getting famous artists into potteries? And so it was our pottery and it was another pottery. And getting them to make things as big as that. And then Art in America would sell them and make some money on it, something like that. So we got asked, would we do it? And we said, sure. Well, how could you say no to something like that? It says, so our assignment, the artists that were sent to us were Helen Frankenthaler, Cleve Gray, Alexander Lieberman, Seymour Lipton, and David Smith. And they were free to do anything they wanted to do, whatever they wanted. They just had to tell us what they wanted in the way of a shape to work on, or did they want to work on their own shape. It was a really kind of a far-out project. In the meantime, Yusuke Aida from Japan had built this table. I can't tell you. It's probably as long as, it's probably, how long is it? Is that long? And it was long, very long and very wide, and he filled it full of plaster of Paris. He made it like a big work table of plaster, so you could make tiles on it. And this was what some of them worked on. Helen worked on that. And Yusuke had been making big tiles on it, which is what he ended up doing when he went back to Japan. But some people did very original things. David Smith wanted us to give him a plate, a basic plate shape, and he would draw on it. And so we made him a big plate, like a 12-inch plate, and made a whole bunch of them. I think they were bisque, so they wouldn't be so fragile. And then he had Londa Wiseman, who actually ended up as a potter, as a model, and he got a hoop from a barn or something, a big hoop, and he had her sit inside of the hoop so he could think in terms of round, because you're going to be on a round plate. And it was a nude, and he did all these drawings. He must have made 100 plates. And he'd brush on a little bit of what do you call it? Some oxide, just brown oxide, and then he'd draw through it. And years later, when I was interviewing one of the people that worked in the pottery at the time, he referred to our friend who was killed in an accident, and I said, well, which one? Having had several friends, he said, oh, you know the one. He's the one that made those Playboy plates. So it's really, I thought, that's how the people in the pottery thought it was. What are we doing making these nude plates, But we didn't run it through during the day, and she never posed for him while the factory was working. But nevertheless, rumor gets out. So those were the Playboy plates. And David Smith referred to Seymour Lipton as the dentist. He said it with a great deal of scorn because Seymour Lipton just brought in a finished piece that he then wanted to make a mold of it so he could make duplicates of it. So he didn't really create anything new. But Helen Frankenthaler, she was hot stuff. She broke every rule in the book. You're supposed to keep clay from drying too quickly and have to let it dry evenly, but she said she wanted to make a big red ball, and she was married to Bob Motherwell at the time, and he was just saying, just give her what she wants. He said, well, you can't make a ball. It's just not the thing you make. And red is a very hard color to get at a high temperature. We don't have that kind of a glaze. So finally she decided she'd settle for plates. So we made this different plate for her, a smaller plate. And she just painted on them. But she took them to the sink and she put them under the sink to wash off some of the stuff. We say, oh, you can't do that because now it won't dry evenly, it's going to crack. Well, it cracked, but for Helen, it cracked beautifully. It looks like she wanted it to crack that way. It was simply beautiful. Everything worked, and her plates were really beautiful. So it was kind of an exciting, it was a kind of an exciting experience for us too. And I have some wonderful pictures that Clem Kalischer took of that event, including everybody working on the clay on this big plastic table, and Yusuke taking his shoes off and kneading it with his feet, and then David Smith getting carried away and taking off his shoes and trying to get on the table and work on the clay with his feet. So that was kind of an exciting experience. Now, at that time in Bennington, I'd say 1963, 64, 65, 66, there was a very, I call it the time of the hero artists. Bennington College was full of hero artists. Suddenly, all these artists appeared at Bennington that were, well, heroes. I mean, people like Jules Zalitsky was just beginning to get discovered, and Peter Stroud, and Tony Caro. Tony Caro came over, and David Smith actually came down to fill in for him till he showed up from England. It was incredible, the people that were there. And this was a whole community of artists. It was very exciting, and they all knew the pottery, and they'd all come by. And David was our particular friend. He used to come over and just stay over, and he was a very special friend. And then I don't have any idea what time it is. How am I doing? Okay. What's that?
Roughly half past.
Okay. Well, I'm getting up to the development of the potter's yard, because where the pottery is now a whole yard. And it isn't the way it used to be. It used to be that when we finally bought the property, after the fire, when we finally bought the property, we began to clean it up. Well, the first thing that had to go were the cars. And we discovered that there was actually money in junk cars. We didn't know that, so we called the junkyard, and they came and hauled them all away and gave us a check. That was a surprise. The other thing that was on the property were all these big oil tanks, fuel tanks, because remember, it's a feed and grain business, and they also had fuel. They used to sell fuel. So we got rid of all the tanks also. And that had a value too, which we hadn't known. And then the grist mill, when Noel Olin went out of business finally, he was a nice fellow, but he was really for horse training and not for selling milk coolers. He went out of business, and we took over the whole property. And then we had to clean up the grist mill, and that was something else, because there was still grain in the bins, and I don't know if you know what happens with grain in the bins. They get hot, and you could have a fire. There was molasses when they would mix molasses and the grains together, there was still molasses in the big molasses holder, and that had sort of leaked out and was all over the floor. It was rodents galore. It was just a mess. It was a real mess, but it was such a beautiful building. I don't know if you've ever seen how a grist mill is built, but there's enough wood in it to make a whole village, really. It's just, what is it? Not 2x4s, it's bigger than that, end on end. And just such a strong building, such a beautiful building. And that everything had slate roofs on them, all of these wonderful buildings. So cleaning up the yard was quite an undertaking. I remember we had a maintenance, sort of a master builder, Glenn Hynek, and he used to say he was trying to get rid of the rats. He said, "If you just let me have a pistol." I said, "No, you can't do it in the town of Bennington. You have to use decon." So as we got rid of the grain, it helped the problem. But getting rid of the grain was a job in itself. But we finally got it all cleaned up, and we decided that we wanted to have other shops around. We wanted to have other craftspeople around. And the first other craft store was a friend of ours, Julie Taylor, who made tailor ties. I mean, all these little anecdotes. And Ralph Lauren was her salesman, who knocked her off and put out rooster ties, which is how he got started. And anyway, her son Justin was a leather worker, and he wanted to have a sandal shop. So he had a sandal shop right there, and we decided Well, we decided in a funny way that what we needed to have was a restaurant at the Pottery. The reason why we did was because by this time people were coming from all over the country to shop. I mean, the thing is that we had national distribution. That was the one. Once we got national distribution and we sold all over the country, people would just turn over the Pottery and they'd see Bennington, Vermont. So whenever they were coming to New England, they'd make a special stop at Bennington. So we did a fabulous business in the summer, in the nice weather time. And then began to do the ski business in the wintertime. Retail business was great. It saved our lives. I can tell you it was a blessing in disguise. But so we decided we had to have a restaurant there because all these people were coming and saying, well, where can I go for lunch? And we'd send them someplace else. And then we finally decided that if you, it's my grandson. If you could feed them, if they stayed there, then that would be good. And what a wonderful showcase that could be. If we had a restaurant that used all our pottery and all the things that we sold in the shop, pepper mills, whatever it was, we'd have it right in the restaurant. We were so naive. We didn't know that people took things. We just had no idea. And those little Peugeot pepper mills at $35 a pepper mill, they went like all the time. They were always gone. So, but we learned. So we finally made ceramic peppers shakers that you could use. But anyway, we thought, well, wouldn't it be a nice idea to have a restaurant right there? And there was a restaurant in North Bennington called the Rain Barrel, and the owner of it was a Frenchman from Alain Midier, and he was taken with the idea of takeout food in the United States, and he wanted to have a takeout food business. So he approached us about having a food business there, and we thought, well, that's perfect. That's just what we want. He was going to call it Chicken Amandine. He was going to have takeout chicken amandine, and he made wonderful food. So he made chicken amandine, chocolate mousse. He didn't have too many things. What is that? I forgot that. You know, it's like a crepe. Yeah, yeah. Creme brulee. And what's the other thing that's like from Alsace? It's very popular. You know, it's like an egg custard. Quiche. That was it. Thank you. Quiche. And he would have this takeout business of quiche and chicken amandine and chocolate mousse and mousse au chocolat, and it was really a very nice idea. And his mother and father had just moved to this country from Algiers, so he thought this would be perfect for them. It was perfect for us. So he would have Papa, who wasn't too well, would sit under a tree smoking. That's all he did was smoke. And he was this sort of cavernous, wizened up man, but he just sat and smoked, and he looked just like he was in France. And Mama, she would come. They were supposed to serve lunch, and about noon, she'd be walking down the street to come and turn everything on and everything. You know, most people start getting their food ready about 9 a.m. So people would begin to pile in, and she would be alone, and she would be serving, and it was very popular. It was a very popular place. They did very well. And then Alain did so well, he decided that why should he pay us rent? He was going to have his own place. The American dream. They get it very quickly. So we said, okay. So he told us he was going to move out, and we decided we were going to look for another restaurant. And we didn't get, before long, we were approached by Dione Lucas, who was a celebrity chef at the time. She was like preceded Julia Childs as a cook on television. She cooked for Brooklyn Gas, and she had a program, and she was a piece of work. She approached me. She was the sister of one of my teachers at Bennington. She was my viola teacher, and who was a wonderful woman, and Dione was a very creative cook. She had been written up in a profile in the New Yorker magazine about her omelets. She was famous for her omelets. So she spoke to me about, she'd been cooking up at the Four Chimneys, which is a classy restaurant from Bennington, except they could never get the guy who answered the phone to not say the Four Chimneys. And they'd say, no. And and she'd broken her arm. She was sort of out of business for a while. And so we ended up with Dione. There was a real, talk about a miscommunication. About the time that we were going to go look at a Blodgett oven, which is, I can't tell you how expensive they are, because she made up a list of the kind of equipment that had to be in this restaurant. And we had this beautiful little spot for a restaurant. It was just a charming little place. She said she wanted David to go with her to Albany to look at this Blodgett oven. See, we didn't even know about Blodgett up here. And so he said, no, I can't. Why would I want to go? She said, well, it's your restaurant. He said, no, it's your restaurant. No, it's your restaurant. No, it's your restaurant. This went back and forth until she fainted. And then we revived her, and she said, oh. So we said, okay, it's our restaurant. We figured this is an unequal struggle. So we said, okay, we want to have a restaurant here. We didn't want to own a restaurant, but if that's what we have to do, we'll do it. So we opened. She was a name. She had a name. She had a following. And what we didn't know was that she was totally unreliable, and she was very nervous, and she had all kinds of ailments. And it was just, we had to have a first chef, a second chef, a third chef, and we never knew from day to day if she was going to show up. Here's a quick little anecdote. She decided she wanted to make a birthday dinner for my daughter for her 16th birthday. So she drew up this elaborate menu, and she came over. She didn't get there till noon, and I'd invited all these people for the dinner. And then the first thing was she started fussing with the oven that it wasn't really even, and that she couldn't make a torte in it. So we had to get the gas company. And anyway, the result of it was that she never got beyond the chicken. She made the chicken supreme de volaille. She made some mousse. That was it. No salad, no nothing, no onion soup, none of the other things that were supposed to be there. But it was a wild attempt, and she couldn't handle it. But so it was hard to have her for a chef. But we managed, and the restaurant was very, I can't say successful, because it managed to lose money regularly. It always lost money. Never made any money, but we had a restaurant there. I understand it's closed now, but it was like the centerpiece of the Potter's yard, and then we had the leather shop, and then we wanted to have. We heard there was a schoolhouse for sale. It was a schoolhouse that had been designed and built by the same man who built the grist mill, and you had to move it. That's all you had to do was move it. That's all you had to do. You should see what it is to move a schoolhouse. It's a lot of work. So we moved it about 4 miles from the south end of Bennington into the Potter. We had the perfect place where we had to build a foundation, which we did, take off the cupola and take off the porch, and then it was really exciting to watch them move it. And they moved it in and rolled it in, and that was another store. And it's still there. All these stores are still there. Most of them. So the yard really developed, and it had a personality of its own. It had a greenhouse, and everything we did was to show people how to use the pottery, how to live with it. And I think that's all I can say for now, because you may have some questions you want to ask. And I'll just tell you about the recording voices part of it, the interviewing part of it. I broke up the different parts of it, and I've got people to talk about the early years and the getting into production, which is Jean is one and Sherry Kaplan is another. And I've got Jerry and Peggy talking in the first part. And we have a dear friend who just died. She would have been a great one for background, but too late. I have people to speak about all the early years, the 1950 to 1960. I got lots of people I've already recorded. I've got the one who said that was a Playboy dish. He was a wonderful worker. I just remember him, Dick Crosstick. He was such a wonderful worker. And he said, well, he really liked working there, but he had to leave. I said, well, why did you have to leave? Because we would have never let him go. And he said, because David wanted to make me a foreman. And he said, I tried it, but then I had to work on weekends, and I could never do that because that's when I go hunting and fishing. So that ended it. I thought, gee, you should have never asked him to do that, and we would have had him forever. So his memories are fine. And then I interviewed somebody. I interviewed all of the art potters I've talked to, and that's very exciting to hear them. I also spoke to Barb Burnell, and he died shortly after. He has a pottery over in Jacksonville, and I kept putting, she'd never put anything off. I had called him several times about it, and he was eager to speak, and when I went over to speak to him, I didn't know he was terminally ill, and he didn't know it either, but we had we talked. I have a 90-minute tape of him, and he spoke about everything. He told me how he came to be there. How he came to be at the pottery was really kind of odd because we had an Englishman working for us, and we liked him very much, and we wanted him to stay. But in order to get him to stay, we had to apply to the Labor Department for a third-party classification. So we wrote up a job description that nobody could fill except Bob Burnell. He read it, and he said, hey, I want to come, and he came, and we hired him. He was just a very good person. So I have his tape, and I have all the art potters' tapes. And I have about 15 tapes in all right now, and I have a few more that I want to get. So I'd be glad to answer any questions if you have any.
You were talking about videos or tapes before?
Oh, audio tapes.
Audio tapes.
Yeah, this is I'm doing a project with the Vermont Folklife Center, and these are oral histories of people. So all of these people are oral history people for the book, and that's a separate project for them. They will own the tapes, and Bennington Museum has asked for a copy of the tapes. So, but yeah.
So there's some real old pottery from Bennington that you see in museums and so forth. Did you try to replicate it? Was there any attempt to?
No. We had our own ideas, and all of those earlier ones, some of them were replications of stuff, Staffordshire ware from England and Parian ware, but and the early Bennington ware was a stoneware with a salt glaze, the jugs that you see. But we never tried to replicate them. When we first came to Bennington, we didn't even understand that there had been potteries there before. We went to the museum and suddenly saw all this pottery, and we thought, well, that's amazing. It is amazing. It is amazing when you realize there's no real big clay deposits nearby, and that fuel is expensive, and that distribution is difficult. As I said, it put Fort Fenton and Norton out of business because to get things to markets, you'd have to float them down the river, which you could do, but then you'd have to get it up to the river. And pottery's fragile, You have to. They'd probably pack it in straw, I would think, or hay. But no, we didn't.
Where did the old potters get their clay then?
Well, there were some clay beds in the Hudson River.
Well, they also had a big brick business in Bennington.
Well, because they had red clay deposits, like Parent Creek. Parent Creek had clay deposits.
Oh,
but of that's
not for pottery.
well for
brick?
brick, sure.
Oh,
But
because I
when
went
you
to the
see
brickyard.
stoneware containers, that has to come from a different kind of a clay deposit. Yeah.
I just, you think it came from Albany?
Oh, I know some of it came from. I know that. Yeah.
Is there any deposit left for pottery clay in
Bennington?
New York?
Oh, I'm sure there is. But there's also, remember there was a big kaolin works in Bennington at one time?
Yeah, and did it play out? Did they use
No,
it?
it just had a very impure brand of
yeah.
kaolin, and
Well,
they used it for paper making, and
yeah,
it wasn't
David
pure
was
enough.
getting clay from
Georgia,
Georgia.
yeah,
and-
Tennessee,
yeah.
Canada, yeah. That's it, getting all your materials is a piece of work.
another
Yeah,
problem.
I didn't go into setting it up. You'll have to read my book. If you want to know how to set up a pottery, you'll have to read my book. Are there any other questions?
When did you come to Burlington? Did you is the Bennington Pottery in Burlington?
Well, that's a store. That's a separate,
Oh,
that's
just
Bennington
the store.
Potters, no, it's a
Okay.
store. And it sells
Not
Bennington
Bennington.
Potters. You know, it has a, it's a separate corporation.
Okay.
Bennington Potters, Inc. is the pottery itself. And there are only two stockholders for the, him and me, is that, mostly him. But